Welcome. In this video, we're going to go through the interpretive questions for week 2. Let's start with the issue of aspects of law. Later writers divided the law into 3 types: moral, social legal, and ceremonial. So moral might be something like no adultery. Social legal might be something like an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, which is if someone maims you in some way, right, they do physical harm to you, their punishment is physical harm, the same amount of physical harm, but no more. Or ceremonial, such as how you're supposed to offer a sacrifice that's being done out of gratitude versus being done because you committed some sin. So, here's a question. Do the passages that we've read suggest any relationship between the different types of law? Okay. Now, we seem to see these as different categories, right? But is there some kind of unity between them that's being presupposed by the text or implied by the text? Right? So how do these, what we see as different aspects of life, relate to each other in the passages we look at from the Old Testament? Our next issue is ancient ethics and morality revisited. So one of our key questions for the whole course is, why does a person have a reason to be moral? We're looking at how views on that changed over time. A definite strain in modern morality says that we should do the right thing because it is the right thing. This is sometimes opposed to doing it because it will make you better off. So Kant will say, well, if you're just doing it because it makes you happy to do the right thing, then that doesn't have real moral worth. The important thing is you do the right thing because it's the right thing. In contrast, ancient ethics seems to be focused on what makes a person better off. In the previous unit, we talked a lot about whether there's an actual difference here. But let's look at this idea of doing the right thing because it's the right thing in terms of the Old Testament, New Testament, and our early Christian writers. So, does the Old Testament seem to have a concept of doing the right thing because it is the right thing? And if so, does its way of understanding that seem to differ from the typical modern concept? And the same question for the New Testament. Does the New Testament seem to have a concept of doing the right thing because it's the right thing? If so, does that differ in some way from the equivalent modern concept? Also, how does the idea of gratitude to God fit into this distinction between morality and making oneself better off? Is it something different, or is it really an aspect of one of those two things? And are there key ways in which the early Christian ideas about being better off differ from Athenian philosophers? Our next issue is Paul and the law. In the chapters from Romans, Paul discusses how Christians should understand the role of the law, i.e., the Old Testament law. Now, the question here is, what positive role does he give to the law? Right? Particularly on a practical level, both in theory and in practice, what positive role does the law have in Paul? Our next issue has to do with the Sermon on the Mount. Some critics argue that it's a mistake to read the Sermon on the Mount apart from its religious context. The key point for our purposes is that its instructions may seem different if it's taken as general ethical advice rather than a form of religious devotion. So here's what I want you to do if you take on this issue. Pick a passage or two from the Sermon on the Mount, explain how it would look if you saw it as a form of religious devotion, then explain how it would look if you saw it as general ethical advice. And, optional, explain how it would look if you did not accept the religious assumptions but took the form of religious devotion as a source of wisdom. Right? So let's say it's turning the other cheek. Right? You might say, well, if you saw it as a form of religious devotion, it would have this relation to Christ's suffering, etc. It would tell people to do this and not that. If you saw it as general ethical advice, it might lead to, say, pacifism. But you might also say, well, suppose that we leave out the general ethical advice aspect, and we look at how people who saw it as a form of religious devotion would have understood it. And see if we can say, okay, well, we wouldn't take it in that way because if we don't accept the religious assumptions. Okay? But if we look at how they understood this, we can learn some important lessons from it. It wouldn't be the same because we don't accept the religious devotions, or I should say, if we don't accept the religious devotions, but right, we can still gain something from it. Now, a point about background knowledge. Keep in mind that in these discussions, we have different strengths, right? We come with different levels of background knowledge. Some people might know the religious side well, some people might know the historical side well, some people might know psychology, etc. If you know these texts well, remember that other people do not. Okay, so if you study the Bible thoroughly, keep in mind that not everyone has. Right? And if you know the historical background well, remember that other people do not. So if you're going to bring in outside ideas, then make sure you clarify it. Okay, there's this other passage in the Bible that says this, or there's this point about the historical background. There's these events that some people might know about, briefly explain them and talk about their significance. Also, be careful about stepping on people's toes. Okay, that is, be careful about, be aware that these are sacred texts for people, and also the people that hold them as sacred texts interpret them in different ways, so be considerate on that point. But also try to be understanding when other people step on your toes. Okay, if there's something that seems disrespectful or disturbing to you in the way that someone interprets your sacred text, give them a lot of leeway. Okay, be respectful about this. When we talk about this, there's going to be things that we feel strongly about, right? And we have to be respectful of each other in that context. And I would say one thing in particular, if you know the passages, say Romans, well, and you know, say, other things that Paul wrote well, keep in mind that what we're talking about is the interpretation of these passages, and not everyone we're not expected to know the rest of the letter, much less all of Paul's writings. So suppose that you think that based on something else that Paul wrote, a certain interpretation must be mistaken. Okay. Please don't say, well, Paul said this elsewhere, so your interpretation must be wrong. Well, okay, maybe you're correct, but the person couldn't be expected to know that. Right? So it would be better to just say, based on other things that Paul said, I would interpret it this way, and I think that this is a consistent interpretation of it, right? But acknowledge that in many cases, there's not enough evidence from these chapters in isolation to prove that your view or the other person's view is the correct interpretation. So keep that in mind. Let's all have a civil dialogue about what the text means.